Now, there are only 150 pages or so to this little book, so obviously it doesn't cover everything in the Hebrew Scriptures. There is a lot that is left out. And I'm just going to fill in just a couple of the holes that the book doesn't tell you about. First of all, why was the book of Genesis written? The Babylonians conquered the Jews and brought most of them into slavery. But then the Persians conquered the Babylonians and let the Jews come back to the Holy Land. And the Persians said, we can let you govern yourself as long as you can come to an agreement among yourselves about who you are and what your law is. But there was a problem because there were two different factions that were very powerful among the Jews. There were the priests and their families, and they identified with Moses because all of the rituals originated during the wandering in the desert. There was another group, the landowners. They identified with Abraham because God promised Abraham the land, and they were the landowners. So the book of Genesis was, in a sense, a history written by these two powerful groups where they compromised with each other to bring together one cohesive story that told their origins. Now, they didn't have a lot of written documentation to go on, so this was all oral history that they pulled together. And at that time, their code of ethics was very different from ours. They weren't so concerned about getting the dates right, the numbers right. They were more concerned about getting the meaning right. So some of this is, in a sense, invented to get the meaning across rather than a historical enumeration of dates and names and things like that. I had somebody just a few minutes ago ask me, did they really live to be in the hundreds the way the book of Genesis talks about? These inflated ages are just to say that they were wise, and the ages will decrease over time to show that gradually people fall into sin, and that results in them living less long lives. So it's all symbolic. It's kind of like if you look at stories about George Washington. He chopped down the cherry tree, and then he couldn't tell a lie, so he admitted to it. That's not a historical fact, but it's a story that we tell to show the kind of values and the kind of character that George Washington had. So you have to take this section of the book of Genesis in that understanding. There are three parts of Genesis. The very first part is completely without any historical background. It's an explanation of how things started, how the world was created. Well, nobody was around when the world was created, so obviously you didn't have any eyewitnesses to write it down. The parts that we're talking about today, there may very well have been these people, but we don't really know a whole lot about them, and so there's a lot of storytelling that evolves around them, whereas the Irish say, if it isn't true, it ought to be. It teaches us a lesson about them and about the history of the people, but maybe the facts aren't exactly right. By the time you get to David, then there's a lot of historical documentation that will show you that these are, in fact, really real people who did this on such and such a day of the week in such and such a year. So that'll come later in the book of Genesis. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Genesis. Names are important. So Abraham and Sarah are very, very old, and they want to have a child because it was essential to have a child. When you got older, you couldn't defend yourself. You couldn't go out and do manual labor. You had to have a child to take care of you in your old age. Usually there were large extended families to take care of the older generation. Abraham and Sarah are out there by themselves, and so they need to have a child, but they're past childbearing age. The name Sarah means she who contends. In other words, she's trying to have a baby, and she's not successful at it. She who contends. When God gives her the promise that she will have a child, he changes her name from Sarai, she who contends, to Sarah, which means princess or queen mother. It indicates that she is going to be the mother of many. Abram means father. That was Abraham's original name, and in a sense it was almost a taunt because he was anything but a father. And God says, yes, you will become a father, and I'm going to up the ante. I'm going to call you Abraham, which is a plural, which means the father of many. So you're not only going to be the father of one, you're going to be the father of an entire nation. And the story of Abraham is a gradual learning to trust God more and more. This God that in the beginning he doesn't know very, very well at all. And God wants to emphasize, this is all going to be done based on my power, not based on your effort. And that only comes to Abraham and Sarah gradually. Sarah laughs in the beginning when she hears she's going to have a baby, because she knows she's well past that age. She can't do it. And God says, but I can do it. Then Sarah thinks, no, I can't do it. And so she gives her handmaid to Abraham, Hagar, to have the baby. And this is a place where I disagree with this book, and I'm not quite sure why they do this. They talk about Abraham committing adultery with Hagar. Now, we look in, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, which was the prevalent law code at that time, as well as the Assyrian code. Both of them allow for multiple wives. You look at how when Abraham and Sarah were moving around, first Abraham told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister because Pharaoh wanted her to be in his harem. Then he told Abimelech the same thing, oh, she's my sister, so that he wouldn't get killed, so that Sarah could be in the harem. So it was very common for there to be a harem, multiple wives. And when we look at Jewish literature, we find that, for example, long after Abraham, Jacob had multiple wives, David had multiple wives, Solomon had multiple wives. If there's a sin here, it's not that Abraham committed adultery. It's more that they still, Abraham and Sarah, were trying to make things happen on their own terms. Since they knew that Sarah was too old, Abraham took Hagar, and they believed that that was the fulfillment of the covenant because they named the son Ishmael, which means God has heard. God's fulfilled the promise. And God's like, no, 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 I told you I would do this. I'm in charge. It's not going to be through Hagar, it's going to be through Sarah, even though she is past childbearing age. So God is showing Abraham and Sarah that he is in charge and that he has the power to do what they can't do on their own. And he does that to get them to trust him more and more. So let's move on to the next generation. Lot. He's greedy. He takes the best land away from Abraham, which was really a rotten thing to do. But he does prove to be a fairly decent person because he takes after his uncle Abe in that he is very hospitable. 3 angels come to Abraham and he's very hospitable. He brings them food and wine, asks them to stay over the night, wants to protect them. When Lot gets 2 angels, he does the same thing. He wants to protect them, he wants to take care of them. In that day and age, to be a traveler, to be an immigrant, was very dangerous because there were a lot of bandits who wanted to mug you. You were vulnerable if you were traveling. And it was part of the ethos of the Jews to welcome the traveler, welcome the stranger, welcome the immigrant, take care of those who are most vulnerable. That runs throughout all of the prophets. Now, we see Lot in Sodom. And a lot of people say, well, the sin of Sodom was homosexuality. That's us reading back into that narrative. Because nowhere does it say that that is what the sin is. As I mentioned, hospitality is important. The men who want to rape the 2 angels are anything but hospitable, because to rape a man was to take away his manhood. And to take away his manhood meant to take away his personhood. He would have no rights, he would be totally humiliated, he would be fit only for slavery. In fact, he might be castrated afterwards. So this was physical violence, this was rape. And even worse than rape, it was permanent depersonalization and subjugation of the people that the men of Sodom wanted to rape. So it's not about homosexuality. Lot offers his daughters, knowing that that might be an attractive alternative to these men. He knows that it's not about their orientation. He knows that it's about the violence being done. The fact that Lot would offer his daughters is horrific to us, but it shows us 2 things. It shows us the lesser status of women in that society, and it also shows us the importance of this value of hospitality. For Lot, it would be the far greater sin to violate hospitality than it would be to offer up his daughters. It's not our morality, but it is their morality. Now, we have a lot of reasons to understand that the sin is a sin of sexual violence and inhospitality, because we find that interpretation in the later prophets. Ezekiel understands it that way, Isaiah understands it that way, and Jesus himself in chapter 10, verses 14 and 15, sends out the apostles to preach the gospel, and he tells them if they meet within inhospitality, if they are rejected, they should leave that town and shake the dust from their feet. And he says to them, it will go worse for those folks than it did for the people in Sodom. Now, if you're talking about homosexuality, there would be no reason, to equate the apostles' preaching with homosexuality. But the apostles being rejected does compare to the idea of Sodom being a rejecting society. So why is this important? Why am I emphasizing this so much? A small minority of us are homosexual. So the majority of us, if it's about homosexuality, can say, does not apply to me, has no effect on my morality. But all of us can fall into the trap of rejecting the stranger, falling into the trap of suspecting people who are different from us, of wanting to ignore the poor, of villainizing immigrants, of falling into racism, and all of that is addressed by this story. Because the story is designed as a reminder to the Jews who have all sorts of Canaanites and Assyrians and Samaritans mixing in their territory, that yes, you have to be decent to these people, you have to be fair to these people, you have to be just to these people. So it's important that we understand the proper interpretation, because then it applies to us, every single one of us, and not only a small subset of us. Okay, let's move on to the question of Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt. But somebody may say, hey, there's Lot's wife. That's not what the story is about. The word in Hebrew for salt is the same word that's used for asphalt, which is a partially degraded petroleum. Now, the Dead Sea is on a rift valley. It's two continents separating from one another, and the land is falling through a series of earthquakes. And we know that along the shores of the Dead Sea, underneath it, there are large reservoirs of petroleum and sulfur. And when petroleum and sulfur come together in oxygen, they erupt, they burn. So we hear that Sodom was destroyed by fire and brimstone, fire and sulfur. So it sounds like there was an eruption, an earthquake. And in fact, we have some geological evidence that suggests that these earthquakes were fairly common in those times, in Old Testament times. One of the byproducts of the reaction of sulfur and petroleum is a partially degraded petroleum called asphalt, or bitumen, tar. So we know that Lot's wife turned around, it says. We think that maybe she just didn't turn around, make an about face, but she actually started to walk back toward the town. Maybe she forgot something that she really prized, and she became part of that cataclysm, part of that volcanic eruption that resulted in this fire and brimstone, and she was covered with bitumen, asphalt, tar. So she became a victim of the flames and the petroleum that erupted out of that earthquake. So again, this is a story that has some historical basis. Do we know exactly when Lot's wife was covered with tar? No, but the message of the story is, don't look back. If God has given you a mission and God has pointed you in a direction, don't turn around and go back based on your own preferences. It's the same as what Jesus says. Whoever puts their hand to the plow and looks back is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. And so it's just a story to remind us of an important value. The historical part isn't as important as the ethos that's being conveyed.